The War of 1812. May 1813. The war thus far. May 1813. Spring and warmer weather, somewhat warmer weather, has returned, and the armies, American and British, are once again on the move. May opens with the siege of Fort Meigs. Fort Meigs, which is being built on a bluff on the east bank of the Maumee Rapids in Ohio, under the direction of Major-General William Henry Harrison, the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. The fort is named in honor of Ohio Governor Return Meigs. Return Meigs. Return being an excellent name for an elected official. According to author Sandy Antal in his book, A Wampum Denied, Proctor's War of 1812, Harrison is intent on, quote, building an impregnable base as a springboard for subsequent operations, end of quote. Man, that's hard to say, impregnable. Oh, never mind. Over in Amherstburg, Upper Canada, Henry Proctor, an aggressive officer, determines on a preemptive strike in order to knock the fort out of commission. He cobbles together a force consisting of 423 regulars from the 41st Regiment of Foot, 63 from the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, 31 artillerymen and 16 other ranks, 462 militiamen, and finally 1,200 Shawnee, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, and Sac warriors under Tecumseh. This gives him, if my math is correct, a force of about 2,200 men, or 2,225 to be more specific. Proctor's force reaches the Maumee on April 23rd, but are unable to get their artillery into position until the 1st of May, when the bombardment begins. In the meantime, Harrison has his men construct 12-foot earthen barriers as shelter from the barrage, which, in the end, causes few casualties. The Americans are low on ammunition, however, so Harrison agrees to give his men a gill or 4 fingers, of whiskey for each spent cannonball they retrieve, the cannonballs then being fired back at the British. When an American relief column of 1,200 Kentucky volunteers under Brigadier-General Green Clay approaches, Harrison determines to break up the siege with a 2-pronged attack. 800 men under Lieutenant Colonel William Dudley are to attack the British battery on the west bank of the Maumee, while Clay's 400 remaining men fight their way along the east bank to the fort. It should have worked. Should have. But once again, the Kentucky militiamen fall victim to their lack of discipline. Instead of halting once their objective had been achieved, Dudley's Kentuckians chase Proctor's native allies into the woods, where the warriors turn around and massacre them. Of 800 Kentucky militiamen, only 150 make it back to Fort Meigs. Amongst those killed is William Dudley. But in spite of the heavy American losses, Proctor and his allies are unable to take the fort, and so, after a final brief bombardment, the siege ends May the 9th. The results of this engagement might be considered inconclusive. While Proctor blocks yet another American offensive, preventing Harrison from attempting to link up with the American forces poised to invade the Niagara region, his inability to destroy the U.S. base of operations will come back to haunt him in the fall of 1813. British Admiral Sir George Cockburn doesn't like Americans, and as commander of a Royal Navy squadron, he is determined to punish them by a series of sea-borne raids in the Chesapeake Bay area and vows to destroy any community that shows resistance. After occupying Spazzuti Island, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Spazzuti Island on April the 23rd, the British follow with a successful raid on Frenchtown on the Elk River on April the 29th. But, as the town of Havre de Grace, I love that name, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly too, Havre de Grace, Maryland, shows the American flag, and worse yet, takes pot shots at the British, Cockburn determines to attack it. As the town lay in an area of shallow water, the British send a flotilla of 16 or 19 boats, depending on your source, to effect an amphibious assault. The town is initially defended by Maryland militia, but after a civilian is killed by a Congreve rocket, they make a hasty departure. In fairness to them, most of these militiamen are apparently quite elderly. But one doughty individual, Second Lieutenant John O'Neill, fires an artillery piece, then a musket at the invading British, wounding their commander, Canadian-born George Augustus Westfall, a future Royal Navy admiral, who is shot in the hand. As O'Neill is Irish-born, Cockburn wants to have him shot as a British subject and therefore a traitor. But instead he decides to release him based on the intercession of, depending on your source again, O'Neill's 15-year-old daughter Matilda or President Madison himself. Perhaps, as historian Alan Taylor suggests in The Internal Enemy, Slavery and War in Virginia, 1772 to 1832, the British released O'Neill, quote, rather than make a popular martyr out of a respectable man, end of quote. The British would burn 40 of the town's 60 houses and vandalize the Episcopal Church. But as Alan Taylor notes, there is a method behind Cockburn's brutality. The property of collaborators and anti-war Federalists is respected, while that of pro-war Republicans and those who resist the British is destroyed. Admiral Cockburn doesn't like Americans. In the end, they won't like him much either. After visiting Toronto, York, and then leaving, always a good plan, Henry Dearborn slowly sets his sights on the next objective, Fort George at Newark, Upper Canada, today's Niagara-on-the-Lake. The Americans arrive on May the 8th and land east of Fort Niagara, outside the range of British artillery. Quick statement of clarification. Fort Niagara is the American fort and lies on the east or New York side of the Niagara River. Fort George is the British/Canadian fort and lies on the west or Canadian side of the Niagara River. The ever-leisurely Dearborn thinks his men need rest. They probably do, and he wants even more troops to tackle the mere 1,000 regulars, 300 militia, and 100 native warriors commanded by his opponent, Brigadier-General John Vincent. Dearborn will finally attack on May the 27th with another successful amphibious assault. The invading troops under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Winifred Scott, captured at Queenston Heights and recently paroled, but the British will claim he has broken his parole as he is not being officially exchanged. Vincent, like Sheaffe before him, determines to save his army and retreats from Fort George, making for Burlington Heights, some 60 miles to the west. He also evacuates the garrisons at Queenston, Chippewa, and Fort Erie. In spite of a broken collarbone received in action, Winifred Scott begins to pursue the retreating British, only to be halted by his superiors, Generals Morgan Lewis and John Boyd, who fear ambush by native warriors. Thus the Americans snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, and Vincent's army, like chiefs at York, will live to fight another day. But as the Yanks are away, Sir George Prevost and Sir James Yeo, commander of the fleet on Lake Ontario, determine to attack the main American naval base at Sackets Harbor, New York, while Commodore Isaac Chauncey and the U.S. fleet is off the Niagara River in support of the attack on Fort George. The attacking force is hastily thrown together, but Prevost manages to raise 870 troops. Departing from Kingston, Upper Canada on May the 27th, the British lose the element of surprise when they are sighted by 3 picket boats left on guard by Chauncey. Ashore, the harbor is defended by 500 U.S. regulars under Lieutenant Colonel Electus Backus. What a great name. Electus Backus, plus 900 militia under Brigadier-General Jacob Brown of the New York Militia, with Brown being in overall command. Brown assumes the British will land at Horse Island, which is connected to the mainland by a partially submerged causeway, and arranges his defenses accordingly. Events unfold as Brown had predicted, and, in theory, he should have had the invaders pinned to the island. But when the British regulars begin to charge across the causeway, the militia takes to its heels, allowing them to gain the mainland. In intense fighting with the American regulars, who stand and fight, the British slowly breach the U.S. defenses. In the confusion, and believing the day lost, Acting Lieutenant John Drury, a young naval officer, executes the plan to burn the naval warehouses and the newly built warship General Pike to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. It is at this point that Sir George, concerned with the mounting casualties and not aware the Americans were setting fire to the naval yard, orders a general retreat, and, in spite of their incredulity, the British soldiers, being professionals, obey, and the flotilla sails back to Kingston. An American victory? When the defenders realize that the British are leaving, they rush to save the General Pike, but the warehouses, including all the booty taken at York, are totally destroyed. Historian Alan Taylor notes that Commodore Isaac Chauncey blames the army for both the attack and destruction, and determines to guard the harbor rather than support the invading American troops for the rest of the 1813 campaign, which allows British naval forces to harass them with impunity. Well, all that sounds more like a British victory to me. Alan Taylor thinks the clear winner of what Wikipedia calls the Second Battle of Sackets Harbor is the ambitious Jacob Brown. As Lieutenant Colonel Backus is killed during the battle, Brown will write the after-action report, which will highlight his involvement, and which he parlays into a commission as a Brigadier-General in the regular U.S. Army. As for me, I think there is another loser, Sir George Prevost. Sir George was a brave man who had served gallantly in combat, but he is also an administrator charged with conserving resources, such as the limited number of soldiers in Upper and Lower Canada. He would have been concerned by the high casualties suffered by the British side. Wikipedia lists 30 killed, 200 wounded, plus 30 wounded prisoners. Not knowing the Americans were on the verge of defeat, he probably decided to cut his losses. But his decision will start some people wondering if Sir George, who, like Sheaffe, was born in the United States, is a secret American sympathizer and just not up to the job of Governor-General of the Canadas and Commander-in-Chief in British North America. But what do you think, dear listeners? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this is your first visit to 1812 channel, my name is Warren and I'm your host. I'm not a historian, nor am I an expert on the War of 1812. Instead, I'm a student wishing to learn more about the conflict. Each month for the roughly 3 years of the war, I will outline the major events. I will also review a book on the war. Did I miss anything today? Any errors? Then let me know in the comments below. When the barrage lifts, cheers! Pictures used in today's video, courtesy of Pics Here, that's PX Here, and 3 of them show Fort George in Canada, but one of them shows another Fort George in a different part of the world. Can you guess which picture that one is? As for the music today, it's the stirring Prelude and Action by that patron of the internet, Kevin MacLeod.